So, our topic today is working with fear. And today also happens to be the World Mental Health Day. And our masters in Swami for a very long time had been predicting something which is going to cause a lot of tumult and suffering in the world. And Master called it a cataclysm. And when we look back what we've gone through in the last year and a half, not that there weren't things before, but particularly as this pandemic started out, there's been a lot of difficulty in the world and people have been struggling. And on the back of this pandemic, there is said to be a mental health pandemic that is brewing. And one of the major causes of that is fear. And if you just look at the numbers of people that passed away in this last 18 months, it's over 5 million people around the world. At least those are the numbers that have been reported. And I don't think in the last 100 years we've seen something of this magnitude happening. And death of a loved one is a big trauma in itself. What's happened on the back of it is also financial loss, job losses, and people being in a state of heightened emotions and fear and not knowing what's likely to happen. Sometimes it seems like things are coming under control, but then you see another wave and another wave coming. There were so many natural disasters that happened. And for us as devotees, I think particularly we have been lucky to be protected and being in that grace of the masters. And the test really for us is how can we stay even minded as we go through some of these very fearful situations all around us. And I'm remembering this story, which was of a farmer. And I think it's very relevant to what we are experiencing as waves of disaster, one after the other. So there was this farmer who lived up in the mountains somewhere in South Asia. And he was making a barely hand to mouth living. And one of his main sources of income was a couple of horses that he had. And then one horse died and he had just one horse. And he used to use that as a cart to ferry things across his produce from the farm into the market. And then one day, his horse disappeared. It just ran away into the forest far, far away. And all the villagers, like they do in the village, came around and said to him, "This is so sad that you were really struggling and you needed this horse to get your produce across, and now that horse has also gone away." And he said, "Yeah, maybe. I don't know. I'm okay. Let's see what happens. Let's see what God has in store for us." A couple of days later, his horse came back with a whole bunch of wild stallions. So he suddenly, from that one horse and the other horse he had died, he suddenly had four horses. And all the villagers came back and said, "This is so lucky. Now you have four horses." And he said, "Yeah, maybe, you know, it's all a divine play. Let's see." And the villagers were saying, "Yeah, but you're so lucky." And he was kind of centered and calm through this. And then, as it would happen, he has a young son, and the son wanted to ride one of these stallions, and he climbed onto it. But the stallion, because it was not trained, really shook him off. He fell and broke his leg. And again, the villagers came and said, "This is so sad that your son broke his leg. Very unfortunate, a young son who could have been of use to you. These stallions are not really reliable." And he said, "Who knows, maybe." And just about a couple of days later, in that kingdom, there was war coming up. The enemy were about to attack. And the local king had given instructions that all the young men in the villages had to join the army. And so all these villagers had their young boys taken away. But when they came to this farmer's home, they saw that his son's leg was broken and he was not of use to the army. And so they left him, and all the other villagers lost their sons in battle. And they would come and say, "How lucky you are that your son got injured and you got to keep him while we lost our loved children? And the farmer said, maybe. So here is an example of how, he went through so many ups and downs. And this is how our lives are too. We go through a lot of ups and downs. Sometimes we think it is a really bad thing that has happened to us. But when we wait and see the larger divine plan and play, then we see that there is a grace as long as we are even minded about it, as long as we are accepting of what Divine Mother has to give us. So that's Swami and Master emphasized even mindedness and calmness, and that sense of intuition and awareness that we need to sharpen and focus so that we can get the right guidance as we go through these fearful times. To really be able to see things in perspective, see things in a larger, beyond just getting out of ourselves, becomes very important. In psychology, often they say that most of us are in our comfort zones, and just outside the comfort zone is the fear zone. So when you step out of your comfort zone, whether it is some work that you're practicing, a job that you're doing, a new skill that you're trying to learn, there is always a lot of fear that we tend to experience. Even if you are learning to ride a bicycle or a car, there is a lot of uncertainty that we experience. But then after that comes a point where there is great ease, and we go into a sphere of completing that learning, and then growth zone lies ahead of that. And I think for us as devotees also, there is this is a time to get out of our comfort zone and go into those zones where we really learn the techniques and teachings of the masters, practice them so that we can go into the spiritual growth zone. It's something that we need to see on a day-to-day basis. It is not something that we can just leave to chance. It has to be a very conscious effort that if I'm experiencing fear, if I'm experiencing unpleasant emotions, how do I take charge of them? Of course, there are extreme situations where the anxiety is out of control and you're feeling totally out of balance. Then that needs attention in a different way. Maybe it needs medical attention. But anything less than that, there is a lot that can be offered by just having faith in God. So, one of the big antidotes to fear is courage. And Swami Shri Yukteswar said this, that if you have fear, go and face it. And when he was a young boy, his mother often, he was a naughty boy, and she wanted to get a little bit of control and order into him. So she tried to put a little fear in him and said, there is a ghost in the cupboard. And he went right there and opened up the cupboard and to ask his mom, where's the ghost? And that's a classic example of, when we feel fear, a lot of times, is it real? Is it imagined? That's a check that we need to do. And the other is, how can we go and face our fears? How can we live with more courage? I think that's what these times are asking us to do. And the big tailwind that we have is of all the masters supporting and blessing and guiding us. And the practices of Kriya and meditation are hugely beneficial in this aspect. I'll share one more story of how faith comes to rescue. And we all know this, but stories just help us see it, because this is a real thing, incident that happened. So this was off the coast of El Salvador, which I think is in Central America. And there was this village where the fishermen were quite poor, and they had to go out to the sea and bring back fish, and that was their means of livelihood. And coincidentally, there was this fisherman whose last name was Salvador. I don't remember his first name. And he was going out in a small glass boat to those boats were called shark fishing boats. Yeah. But it's a very small boat with fiberglass. It doesn't have a lot of technology. It doesn't have a sail. And he was going out to bring, and he was a shark hunter, and that boat was for shark hunting. So he was a 35-year-old man, had spent about 10, 12 years fishing. He knew the sea and how the sea can be rough and all of that. And he took with him a 22-year-old boy from the village that day. And they went into the deep sea. That you have forgetting hunting shark, you have to go into the deep sea. So they went into the deep sea, and as they were getting into the zone, a storm came, and the storm was very rough, and their boat's motor failed, and they were getting tossed around. They lost their radio connection, and they were just at the mercy of the ocean, the Pacific Ocean, and were getting washed away in different directions. The young boy with him was very fearful, and he kept saying, I'm going to die, and I love my mother. I'm going to die, and I love my mother. His name was Ezekiel. And Salvador kept saying to him, have faith in God, have faith in God. He will protect. And even internally, for Salvador, this was the message that he was constantly chanting, that God will protect me, God will protect me. We will reach the land, we will be fine, we will be safe. This went on for about 6 to 7 days, and then Ezekiel completely lost his hope. And when that happened, he slowly died. It was very sad for Salvador. He kept wondering, why didn't I also die? Why do I have to live and see this suffering? And there is no hope. We don't know where we are. He can see airplanes flying by, but nobody is going to see him because this is a small boat, fiber boat with no signages, nothing for protection or catching attention. And then for 4 or 5 days, he had the body of Ezekiel in the boat just to give him courage. And then he realized he can't, so he had to throw the body away in the sea. And at that moment, he was deeply tempted to throw himself into the ocean. And he heard this voice inside of him saying that it's not yours to take. Your life is not yours to take. Have patience, have faith. You will be protected. And he just went with that. So he kept chanting this faith and calling and praying to God. This went on for 427 days in the year 2012, and you can read it on the internet. So that's a very long time. Finally, one day he saw a mountain far away, and he knew that land was close. And he jumped off his boat and swam to the shore, and that was off the coast of Mexico. And people saw him and took him into a hospital, and he was totally hair was all knotted. He had been in the same clothes, the beard was grown. Food he had in the sea was all raw fish and birds that he could catch. Very rough life, but the thing that kept him going in the worst of circumstances was having faith. And I think there is a very powerful message in that. How can we be patient when everything around us is completely doom and gloom? How can we be accepting of what comes to us? Because it is good and bad that comes to us, like we saw in the other story. The farmer, one day was great and another day was really bad. But we don't know how the larger play is and how it'll all work out. So the message is, when you experience fear, the antidote is faith. Having faith that God will always protect you. And as we talk of the sea and the boat, there is also the poem God's Boatman. And Master made a divine promise. He said 1,000,000,000 times, with bleeding feet, I will come back. As long as one devotee is left, one brother. So that's the protection that we have. That's the divine promise that we have. And if we can just remind ourselves as we go through these extraordinarily tough times, sometimes it's a very close loved one who's suffering, or there is a death that you've not been able to process. There is that bereavement that's going on. There are other fears that come up of your own health or of your employment or your financial situation or the environment. But God is always there. And there is a reason why we need to go through these experiences. But there is also hope on the other side. There is also courage that we can consciously choose to practice, that no matter what happens, I'm not going to succumb to fear. Devotees are always courageous, and we have that inner strength in us, which is what we need to invoke more and more of. And in that way, we can work with our fears, with faith, with patience, with attunement to the divine, and leading a life that is spiritually uplifting. That's the lesson we are here to learn. So, wishing you strength and courage in these extraordinarily difficult times, and hope that we are able to cross this raft of delusion with faith like Salvador did.